Let's talk about something that, on the surface, seems like a huge contradiction: Black America's relationship with Christianity. It's this incredible story of deep, powerful faith that was literally forged in the fires of an institution that was often used as a weapon against them.
I mean, the history here is it's brutal, and you can't deny it. One of the very first ships to bring enslaved Africans to the Americas was actually named Jesus. White Christians twisted Bible verses to justify chattel slavery, a system where human beings were treated like property. They even created special slave Bibles, where they just cut out any part that talked about freedom and kept all the parts that preached obedience.
So you'd think, right, that this history would turn people away. Well, here's the twist. Despite all of that, today, a staggering 79% of Black Americans identify as Christian. That's a higher rate than any other group in the entire country.
So what gives? That's the core question we're diving into today. Why are Black people still Christian? And beneath that question is an even deeper one that people have wrestled with for centuries. Given all this suffering, does God hate Black people?
To get our heads around this, we're going to look at two really powerful and totally different viewpoints. First up, let's explore the case for doubt, and we'll do that through the eyes of religious scholar and former pastor, Dr. Anthony Pinn.
Dr. Pinn basically puts it right out there. He says, look, if God is supposed to be all-loving, all-powerful, and just, then how do you explain the centuries of disproportionate suffering that Black people have endured? For him, you just can't reconcile those two things. It forces you to ask a really tough question about God's character.
And he doesn't stop there. You know how in the Black church there's often this identification with the Israelites, God's chosen people who are delivered from slavery? Well, Pinn flips that on its head. He says if you actually look at the history of being conquered and oppressed, the Black experience in America looks a lot more like the Canaanites, the people who, as he puts it, get a whooping in the Bible.
Okay, so that's a pretty heavy argument for doubt. But now let's flip the coin and look at the case for faith. And for this, we'll turn to the perspective of preacher and theologian Claudia Allen.
Her whole argument really hinges on this idea she calls the experientially Black Jesus. Now, let's be clear, this isn't about saying Jesus was Black in the way we think about race today. No, it's about his life experience. The argument is that Jesus' life as an oppressed person makes him someone that Black and brown people can uniquely identify with.
So let's break that down. Think about Jesus' life story. He was born under a brutal military occupation during a genocide of baby boys. Then he becomes a refugee, and his family flees to Africa, to Egypt, to survive. He grows up poor in a working-class town. He's then falsely accused by the powers that be, and he's ultimately executed in the most horrific, public way possible. For so many people, that's not the story of some distant, untouchable God. That's the story of one of them.
Okay, but this brings up a huge and fair critique, right? Isn't Christianity just a white man's religion, a tool that colonizers forced on the people they enslaved?
Well, history shows it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Christianity had a presence in Africa long before Europeans showed up to start the slave trade. I'm talking way, way back. Ethiopia became a Christian nation in the 4th century. And get this, ancient peoples like the Akan in Ghana had their own creation stories that are surprisingly similar to the ones in the Hebrew scriptures. So these ideas were there long before colonialism.
All right, so we've got these two really strong, conflicting ideas. How do we bring them together? Let's try to do that by digging into the Black church itself, the text, and this fundamental idea of human choice.
Inside the church, something incredible started happening. A completely radical theology of resistance began to grow. Can you imagine the sheer power in the late 1800s in Atlanta for a Black minister named Henry McNeil Turner to stand up and declare, God is a Negro? That was a massive political statement. It was a way of saying, in a world that tells us we are less than human, that we are made in the image of God.
But look, the Black church has never been a monolith. It's always been complex. On the one hand, it was the first institution truly owned and operated by Black people, for Black people. It was a center for political organizing. But on the other hand, it often had its own blind spots, right? It struggled to deal with issues of gender and sexuality. And sometimes it promoted what's called respectability politics, this idea that if Black people just acted more like mainstream white people, they'd finally be accepted.
This kind of leads me to a different way of looking at this whole thing. What if this isn't about God's will, but about human action? You could argue that one of the biggest themes running through the entire Bible is the idea of choice.
So if you look at it that way, all the systemic suffering Dr. Pinn talks about, it's not an act of God. It's the direct, catastrophic result of centuries of human choices. The choice to colonize, the choice to start the slave trade, The choice to literally rewrite the Bible to control people. The choices that built segregation and mass incarceration. These are all human decisions, with devastating consequences that we still feel today.
And here's something that really drives this point home. Remember those slave Bibles? It's what they took out that tells the whole story. They intentionally removed books like Exodus, the entire story about God liberating enslaved people, because that message was just too dangerous, too radical. When you read the full, unedited text, you see a story where time and time again, God is on the side of the oppressed, not the oppressor. So, when you strip away all the theology and the history, what's left? Why does this faith still hold so strong? I think it boils down to one incredibly powerful thing.
Hope. It's that simple. At its very core, the faith offers hope. A promise that no matter how hard, how brutal, how painful today is, a better tomorrow is coming. And sure, you could just dismiss that as therapy, but that kind of hope is a powerful, powerful motivator.
And don't mistake that hope for just wishful thinking. This hope has had real, tangible, world-changing results. The Black church, with all its complexities, became the engine for that hope. It produced music and art that has shaped the entire world. It built an unbelievable resilience, and it fueled the movements for justice and liberation that have truly bent the arc of history.
So I'll leave you with this question to think about. When you're facing down centuries of systemic oppression, when all the evidence says things are bleak, is choosing to have hope, choosing to believe in a better future, is that the ultimate act of resistance?